Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Surya Prakash Upadhyay from Indian Institute of Technology, Mandi. So today we are going to talk on module Informal Settlements from paper Sociology of Urban Transformations. So after completing this module, you will be able to define informal settlements. We also look in this module at the shortage of housing in cities and how gives rise to informal settlements. The module also looks at the socio-economic and policy deficiencies and discusses how and why informal settlements develop. Further, the module discusses the policy responses towards the informal settlements. So when we think of informal settlements, many of us think of jhuggi jhopdi, kacha structures built with most basic materials such as mud or tin walls, a length of plastic of tin or for roof, on public or private lands outside the town planning framework. So whether they are called shanties, bastis or slums, such informal settlements are often seen by policymakers and elites as the bane of Indian urbanization. So in this view, the slums subverts land use and planning regulations and harbors public health hazards, poor sanitation, and inadequate supply of basic public services. Yet, the informal settlements encompass tremendous diversity, from temporary shanties to notified slums to unauthorized settlements where housing is predominantly pakka. So in this module, we aim to ask, what do we mean by informal settlements? Why do they emerge? Is it really possible to attain a slum-free India? If so, what policies can help achieve it? In this module, we discuss some of the data on informal settlements in Indian cities against the backdrop of severe shortages in housing availability for specific income groups and how and why informal housing emerges. Further, we analyze policy responses to informal settlements and assess the effectiveness of policy initiatives that aim at a slum-free India. So having said the outline of the module, the rest of the module is divided into 5 sections. So this section looks at some of the data on informal settlements in Indian cities and against the backdrop of severe shortages in housing availability for specific income groups and how and why informal housing emerges. Later on, we will discuss, or we will rather analyzing policy responses to informal settlement and assess the effectiveness of policy initiatives that aim to make India a slum-free India. So in this section lays out some definition. Much like definition of the urban that we discussed in module 2.1, scholarly and policy definitions of informal settlement also varies widely across countries, as well as states and cities. Therefore, international definitions by UN agencies may offer a useful starting guide. It is worth quoting in a full definition offered by an issue paper for the UN Conference on Housing and Sustainable Development, that is UN Habitat. It reads out, informal settlements are residential areas where 1. Inhabitants have no security of tenure vis-a-vis the land or dwellings they inhabit, with modalities ranging from squatting to informal rental housing. 2. The neighborhoods usually lack or are cut off from basic services and city infrastructure. And 3. The housing may not comply with current planning and building regulations and is often situated in geographically and environmentally hazardous areas. Further, slums can be seen as the most deprived and excluded forms of informal settlement. It can be argued that the most important issue that informal settlements face is land tenure. Land tenure refers to the rights of individuals or groups in relation to land. Security of tenure is a central issue because its absence also means constant threat of eviction. As McFarlane notes, insecure tenure is associated with poor quality housing, actual or free of consecutive demolition, lack access to sufficient and clean water and sanitation facilities, and polluted environments with high level of vulnerability to illness and disease. In an important report, UN Habitat distinguished between two categories of informal settlements, that is, the squatter settlements and illegal land developments. So, squatter settlements are housing units constructed on land to which occupants have no legal claim or have not purchased. In contrast, illegal settlements or subdivisions refer to settlements where legal owners have allocated plots to occupants through sale or resale, subdivision, leasing, or rent. The illegality arises from features such as low standard of services or infrastructure, breaches of land zoning, lack of planning and building permits, or the irregular nature of the land subdivision. The UN Habitat definition emphasizes physical and legal aspects of overcrowding, poor housing, inadequate access to water and sanitation, and insecure tenure, and plays down the social aspects of economic and social marginality characterize the slum in popular imagination. Squatter settlements correspond to what is known as slums and are widespread across the developing world, from the favelas in Rio de Janeiro to Barricada in Lima and barrios in Manila. Slums or bastis. Slums are commonly known as or called as bastis, and how they are related to urban poverty, this we are going to discuss in this section. So scholars note that the term slum has had a long and troubled history and being seen as a source of social vices such as immorality, crime, and dysfunctional families. And they do not consider slum as a consequence of social inequality. Similarly, recognizing the legal connotation of the term and its absence from vernacular discourse in India, authors such as Gautam Bhan prefer terms such as basti. The label of slum thus requires careful unpacking and analysis even in India. As Naidu and Bhan note, in the context of present-day Delhi, the old walled city have been declared as slums. The booming economies of these areas, as well as the relatively higher levels of public services, may not bear out the characterizations of slums we have discussed above. Based on the varying classification as slum of old city areas, despite the serious problems of dilapidated housing and urban decay in these areas, Naidu argues that the administrative level of slum reflects a political decision rather than an objective assessment of housing quality alone. In light of this evidence, to what extent does the census class of slums adequately captures aspects of urban poverty and vulnerability? This question needs to be asked. Gautam Bhan and Jana critically analyzed the three categories under which slums are counted in census. These are notified slums that are declared as such under any statute including Slums Act. This means the Slums Area Improvement Clearance Act of 1956, which includes buildings are unfit for human habitation, though it in no way takes account of tenure. Similarly, the recognized slums are considered that they may not be notified under statutes but are acknowledged and categorized as slum by state or local authorities. And the last is this identified slums, which corresponds to of at least 300 residents or about 60 to 70 households of poorly built, congested tenements in unhygienic environment, usually with inadequate infrastructure and lacking in proper sanitary and drinking water facilities, that are identified by the charge officer and inspected by a nominated officer by the Directorate of Census Operations. Now, you noted that this characterization does not consider the underlying characteristics that qualify a housing cluster to be listed as a slum. So only the official categories under which they are counted. Even here, Bhan and Jana note several issues in the census reckoning of the slum population that deserve attention. First, they caution that the size cutoff of 60 to 70 households in the category of identified slums would exclude many smaller clusters of vulnerable households. Placing this in the context of increased displacement in Indian cities, Bhan and Jana argue that these evictions are accompanied by low rates of resettlement because evicted households cannot either or are not eligible for resettlements or cannot afford transport or other costs of living in urban peripheries where most resettlement sites are located. The households are rendered homeless or relegated to highly precarious tenements where the cycle of eviction is likely to continue. Thus, the category of slum does not take full account of urban poverty and vulnerability. In practice, this means that states and cities that report low levels of slum population, according to the official or census definitions, may be severely underestimating levels of marginalization and deprivation. Moreover, they point out that data on services delivery in slums may overstate access by not taking account of quality of service. Thus, for example, data in the aggregate shows that slums have better access to treated tap water than non-slum household, but this is premised on shared and communal taps rather than household access to in the former case. So now we need to move beyond this notion of slum and look at various aspects of this informal settlements. So across India, informal settlements encompass a tremendous variety beyond the slum or basti, or does the policy response to them, as does the policy response to them. They include forms such as the unauthorized colonies in Delhi, the Guntewadis in Maharashtra, Akarm or Sakarm of Karnataka, among many others. These settlements correspond to the UN Habitat category of illegal developments. For instance, in Delhi, unauthorized colonies comprise housing that is built on land not included in the development area in the plan, or one built on land within the development area but not yet zoned for residential use. These unauthorized colonies are often established by land assemblers or aggregators who buy rural land and then chop it up for sale into plots. In these cases, the plot owners are not squatting. They hold paid ownership of their land in some sense, but may not be able to register legal title on the land with relevant authorities because land falls outside the plan. Also, because these colonies are not included in the master plan, they have typically not eligible for basic municipal services. So even unauthorized colonies vary widely in size and character. Some such as Sangam Vihar house over 1 million inhabitants, while others such as Sainik farms are exclusive enclaves of the elite. Elsewhere in the states such as Maharashtra, there are forms such as Gunthewadi, that is a construction on a layout with plots that are around 1000 square feet, that is less than the acceptable norm for planning, which is 3000 square feet. Amitabh Bhide notes that these layouts are rendered unauthorized for several reasons. One, they are below the minimum size suggested by the planning regulation and may not follow building codes. Two, the land use has not been appropriately converted from agricultural to non-agricultural. And three, the layouts are not approved under the applicable Maharashtra Regional and Town Planning Act. Many of these studies draw on city-level research in the absence of comprehensive national data and standardized terminology for informal settlement in this mode. Nonetheless, it should be noted that such unauthorized developments are an important component of informality in Indian cities. In Delhi, housing almost 5.3% of the total population. Lama Reval and Leminsky argue that in the context of Delhi, these unauthorized colonies comprise a missing middle of urban governance, including a large section of the lower middle classes, and hence their political and policy significance. So, informal settlements have emerged as a major response to housing shortage in India and across the world. In the next section, we will trace the contours of this crisis and explore the origins of informality in human settlement in India. We also need to understand the informal housing and how they number in the different data sets. So the number of people living in cities in the developing world is expected to double by the middle of the 21st century, and the spatial extent of those cities is expected. The majority of new urban dwellers will meet their housing needs in illegal settlements in informal city spaces. In the case of India, with urbanization, cities will contain 40% of the total population and produce 70% of the GDP by 2030. It has been reported by McKinsey in 2010. To house these many people is a mammoth task, given that there is already. So in 2012, about 18.78 million, that is 1.8 crore households, grappled with housing shortage in urban India, as per the estimate of the Technical Group on Urban Housing Shortage, constituted by the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation. This included those who were homeless, lived in non-serviceable kacha housing, lived in badly depreciated houses, or unacceptably congested ones. The estimate was based on census and NSS 65th round results on housing condition and urban slums. What was worse was that the total housing shortage across both self-owned and rental categories was the worst in the lowest decile by the expenditure, that is the poorest households. In contrast, the top decile, that is 10% of the household by expenditure, faced the lowest housing shortage. In another estimate by the private sector from KPMG, some 18.4 million houses were needed in one bedroom economically weaker section, that is EWS, and another 13.8 million in lower income group, that is LI segment, that is nearly 3.2 crore houses by 22. According to the Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, 52.37 million people, as against an urban population of 286.12 million in census 2011, lived in slums. Further, the authors reported projections by the report of the Committee on Slum Statistics and Census 2010. This estimate put the slum population in all 5,161 towns in 2001 at a higher 75.26 million, that is nearly 26.31% of the urban population, and going up to 104.67 million people in 2017. Interestingly, over a third, that is 36.6% of the entire slum population of India's million plus cities was in Mumbai. The ministry report also reported other features of India's slum population. But the most important was the caste breakup. Dalits comprised nearly 18.5% of slum populations, as against 10.2% of non-slum populations. Indeed, the 2001 census also showed that of the total scheduled caste in the urban areas, 28.8% reside in the slums, compared to 20.9% of the scheduled caste and 16.9% for others. And this suggests that slums also, to some degree, serve to especially segregate Dalit citizens away from the high caste in the city. So, what are the policy responses towards informal settlements? So, in considering policy responses to informal settlements, it is important to note one of the most important ways that are adopted by the governments, that is the demolition and eviction. So, demolition drives routinely affect squatter settlements in Indian cities. So, in the national capital, Gettner highlights how these demolitions have been justified by a legal discourse that construct slums as nuisance. In the case of Delhi, from 1990 to 2010, even just taking government data, over 260 buses were demolished in the city. Gautam Bhan notes that the extent of eviction was so extreme that the 2011 census recorded a 25% fall in population in the New Delhi district, and this attributing to it directly to evictions of slums and Jhuggi Jhopdi clusters. In Bhan's words, contemporary Delhi is a city scared by the repeated evictions of the homes of its poorest residents in a scale unseen since the emergency. Other metropolises have similar numbers, though there are few national surveys or counts. For instance, both Mumbai and Kolkata, according to non-governmental data, 2004-5 saw over 450,000 to 7 lakh people being displaced. DuPont notes that laws in states such as Maharashtra aim to prevent slums by defining them as encroachments. As in Delhi, the court supported this interpretation. More significantly, the Slum Act of 1957 distinguishes between notified and non-notified slums, with the latter being excluded from improvement in basic services. However, more effective policy responses have also evolved over time. While many of these such were city-level programs for resettlement or site and service programs, a number of national programs emerged alongside the JNNURM. These included JNNURM program Basic Services for the Urban Poor, which evolved into the Rajiv Awas Yojana and the Integrated Housing and Development Program for smaller towns and 1 non-million plus cities. The Rajiv Awas Yojana, successor of BSUP, was ambitious in its aim to create a slum-free India through an integrated slum redevelopment, including housing infrastructure and titling. In a study of 2 BSUP cities, Lalita Kamath notes 3 shifts in these approaches. 1. The state has withdrawn to a facilitator's role in order to encourage market mechanisms, allowing non-governmental actors to participate. There is an increased focus on tenure security. Third, community participation and management of housing is being encouraged. And lastly, eligibility for subsidies is increasingly determined through biometrics and similar technologies. This last has come in for specific criticism. When it comes to unauthorized settlements and guntewadis, the preferred policy option has been regularization. That is, a process by which the colony is made legal. The property titles are recognized by law and can be registered, and they are subject to charge also. These regularization legislations are largely implemented at the state level. For instance, in Maharashtra, Guntewadi Development Regularization, Upgradation and Control Act was passed in 2001. A key feature of such drives is that they apply a cutoff date such that only plots developed before the date are eligible. Thus, Delhi has seen multiple regularization drives that have failed to regularize a proportion of unauthorized colonies, thus continuing to produce informality in inhabitation. Other critiques are also pertinent. Jimmer notes, for example, that in Delhi, regularization remains largely delinked from infrastructure provisions in practice, even though services provision is a precondition of it. Nonetheless, the fundamental limitation of this approach is that it holds out but does not quite fulfill the promise of post facto adjustments. In the case of Solapur, Lalita Kamath argues that the planning regime incites illegalities from the poor and indigenous bourgeoisie at the same time. Elsewhere in Maharashtra, Amitabh Bhide concurs, regularization acts as a perverse incentive for the generation of new informalities and strengthens the very phenomenon it seeks to control. the most prominent government scheme for addressing slums in India in 2009, Rajiv Awas Yojana, which has a vision of slum-free India, a scheme that is similar to the idea and practice of incremental housing as discussed. So let us now summarize what we have learned in this module. We learned that the informal settlements encompass a tremendous variety beyond the slum or basti, as does the policy response to them. Despite their economic value, slums have been subjected and viewed in a negative light, and often slum dwellers are termed as encroachers. The use of term serves to provide legitimacy to a situation where the poor came to be seen as unworthy of legal and constitutional protection. People who live in informal settlements are not accorded full citizenship rights to the city. Some scholars, like Ananya Roy, have argued that a full recognition of legitimacy by the state to informal settlements in their illegal occupation of land would threaten the structure of legally held property. The basic services that are extended to the poor are due to important social, economic, and political reasons, ranging from ethnic ties, availability of low-cost labor, and the city's largest voting population to support particular political candidates. As a result, a range of services and facilities are extended on a case-to-case, ad hoc, or exceptional basis without jeopardizing the overall structure of legality and property. Therefore, the slogan of Slum-Free India only partially addresses the issues of informality in habitat. Moreover, policies aimed at preventing informality often exacerbate it. Thank you.